Hello and welcome back to this damn philatalistic crusade. In this video, I want to talk some about the importance of Harry Saltzman to the James Bond film franchise and how his contributions, I think, over time, whether intentionally or unintentionally, have been downplayed to the point of most people, and even James Bond fans in this day and age, are not aware of the extreme importance of Saltzman to the series. It must be stressed that without Harry Saltzman, there would not be a James Bond film series, and without Harry Saltzman, the key cocktail that made up the original James Bond formula would have never been the same, and likely without his unique, wild spark, wouldn't have reached the same level of worldwide success as it did in the Bond mania of the 1960s. Part of the everlasting appeal of the character is having a wild sense of adventure and a larger-than-life quality in ways, but also a gritty, two-fisted realism in others. And fascinatingly, people have all kinds of Harry Saltzman stories and how much of a character he was, but everybody can agree that for every crazy, dumb, bad idea that he could come up with, and he could come up with quite a lot, he would come up with absolutely incredible, wild ideas that nobody else could have thought of. So his contributions are so vast, and it pains me to no end that you never see Saltzman's name included in all the official blurbage, and he's rarely referenced when he was the original co-producer of the films, and Eon was founded between Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli. And most importantly, it was Harry Saltzman who had the option on the James Bond novels, and not Cubby Broccoli, who had tried to do so before and not been successful. And Broccoli wanted to try and basically make another go at it, but Harry Saltzman had actually been the one to actually get the rights to all the novels except Thunderball and Casino Royale, and do that in the interim. But his option was expiring, which is why he said that he would be open to striking a partnership with Cubby Broccoli. And that, of course, led to the development of both Dan Jack, named after their wives, and Eon Productions that still exists today. It is absolutely criminal that you don't see Harry Saltzman talked about at least more often. It makes sense why Cubby Broccoli takes most of the focus. He was the stable hand on the tiller. He was the captain of the ship of the James Bond franchise. He was the one with the vision. He was the one who was determined to make Bond a success and wanted to stay with it because he believed in the character and the property, and did so for the rest of his career. It was Cubby Broccoli who deservedly won the Thalberg Award, and even though their partnership had ended very badly, and the split was not really good for either of them in terms of business or career, he did graciously include Saltzman in his acceptance speech, and they do seem to have somewhat buried the hatchet. But Cubby Broccoli was much more in the spotlight for a long period of time. Harry Saltzman's career, while he did manage to get another credit or two, after The Man with the Golden Gun, his film producing career, in effect, was largely kind of over. And it's quite sad that it went that way. But Cubby Broccoli was focused and determined to make Bond a success. Harry Saltzman was naturally sort of wired to have 50 different plates spinning in the air in terms of other projects and ideas. And of course, what led to the final breakup of the partnership was his attempt to buy the Technicolor Corporation, not going so well. And then he put up his shares in the James Bond franchise as collateral, which he was not allowed to do. And it just turned into a gigantic kerfluffle. But Saltzman was an ideas man. He was a showman. He had a whole history of being a showman. But while you may think that would lead to him having a tendency to produce wild, over-the-top, gargantuan epics, ironically, his greatest films and his biggest successes had a gritty edge. He had founded Woodfall Productions, which produced some of the most famous films of the British kitchen sink realism drama, particularly Look Back in Anger and Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which were absolutely groundbreaking. And I think there is some of this that carries over into the 9 James Bond films that he was involved in, from Dr. No through to The Man with the Golden Gun. While he was not necessarily the easiest person to get along with in terms of the anecdotes you'll hear. You'll note that everyone has a certain fondness when they would recount their Harry Saltzman stories in a way, but that also he had a particular knack of knowing what would resonate in terms of a story with an audience. And if you look at the first 9 films, there are particular factors and qualities that they've never quite been the same since. And I think part of that sort of two-fisted tenacity and focus on realism is felt definitely in the first 2 Terrence Young directed James Bond films, and to a degree in Goldfinger as well, but also in his other side project that he started, because Saltzman could not just stick with one thing. He produced the 3 Harry Palmer films starring Michael Caine, the first of which was 1965's The IPCRESS File, and for my money, I find that is the greatest spy film ever made outside of the James Bond series. But The IPCRESS File is definitely the best and most beautifully well-crafted, for lack of a better term, serious, hardcore espionage film. And the other 2 films are fascinating follow-ups, each one being entirely different, starting the whole Mission Impossible film franchise precedent of having different directors and different styles of films long before Tom Cruise ever started that series. So that is not an original concept. That was actually started and done by Harry Saltzman with the 3 Harry Palmer films in the 1960s. Those, along with, of course, The Battle of Britain, are probably his biggest non-Bond successes. But it is to his credit that he was not one to rest on his laurels, but you can also see why his career was more short-lived compared to Cubby Broccoli, again, having that more sort of feeling of having the stable hand on the tiller and a clear view of the goal in sight. And also Cubby Broccoli had more industry connections and more of a history in the actual studio system. So they basically got on like oil and water. And so the partnership was probably never destined to last. In a lot of ways, it's probably kind of amazing that it lasted as long as it did, but they complemented each other in interesting ways. And what Harry Saltzman brought to the table is a key part of the original 1960s cinematic Bond formula, and what made it so strikingly different to everything else that was in the cinematic marketplace. Because he wasn't one to have a film with his name on it that was just normal or had a limp quality or just kind of sat there. So maybe if he couldn't necessarily put it into the exact words of what he was getting after, between all of the amazingly off-the-wall wild ideas he could come up with, he had a sort of outsider's perspective in a way, because he wasn't a traditional studio man. He hadn't come up through the Hollywood system in the way that Cubby Broccoli had. And so it was this certain energy that he brought that is only in the first 9 of the James Bond films. And as much as I adore the entire original series, there is a distinction between the first 9 and then The Spy Who Loved Me Through License to Kill, where Cubby Broccoli was producing solo and had to basically sort of reinvent the series in order to continue. Part of what makes The Man with the Golden Gun sort of scattershot in a way is because it was being produced when the partnership between the 2 was breaking up completely, and they were not even really on speaking terms, and everybody knew sort of what was going on, even though it wasn't being expressly said. And then the actual dissolution of the companies and things turned into quite a bit of a legal battle, and that went on for some time, which is part of what led to the delay of The Spy Who Loved Me coming out 3 years later. It was in a lot of ways like a bad divorce case of the 2 parties both being kind of at each other's throats a bit, and nasty things being said and done, and it took a while to sort of heal that. But with Saltzman basically being removed from the equation, and this happening in the early to mid 1970s, it's meant that ever since then, his presence hasn't been there, and he hasn't been in the credits, and he hasn't been talked about. So part of his being sort of relegated to the background of history is due to the passage of time. That is understandable, but I do think there needs to be a concentrated effort to actually make sure that his contributions are properly highlighted, because you just don't see that hardly at all. And it's when I talk to other fans who don't really know what Saltzman did, or just think he was the wild ideas man because they've heard the anecdotes and some of the making ofs, or read about Harry stories, which are always wonderfully amusing. That's what really bugs me, and led me to want to make this video. And there's nothing wrong with fans being led to believe that, because that's what that's what the sort of material indicates, because Saltzman isn't really talked about all that much. So again, I don't think it's something that Eon is necessarily doing on purpose or out of spite or something, but it would help if they would, occasionally reference the man who actually got the deal to option the James Bond novels, and who was the co-producer on the first 9 films. It would help, It's also an unfair comparison, of course, because Harry Saltzman was only involved with the first 9 films, and then his producing career kind of outside of that went not so well after the 1960s, partially due to bad business venture choices or projects that just ultimately didn't come to fruition, or having far too many projects at once, and being so spread across different areas. But Harry Saltzman didn't have the career longevity that Cubby Broccoli did. Cubby Broccoli won the Thalberg Award. Cubby Broccoli got to write his own autobiography. Harry Saltzman did not. So it is an unfair comparison, admittedly. But the reason why I wanted to make this video is that it's just a particular feeling that I myself have had for a number of years, and I've talked with other Bond fans who feel the same, so it's not just me, thankfully, being the one Bond fan yelling in the wilderness that Harry Saltzman isn't talked about enough. But he really isn't. And what I think perfectly encapsulates all of this, and the difference between Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli, is that their partnership actually started fracturing quite early. Really, once the films became incredible successes, they didn't really see eye to eye as much. Not that they really did much to begin with. And then they really weren't on speaking terms, and it just got progressively worse. So after a certain point, they actually started alternating who was lead producer on the individual Bond films. And so basically one would be on the set and being the active producer, while the other would stay in the offices and do the more day-to-day business activities of keeping the production going. And that way they could achieve all the duties of producer and not have to be in the same room. And they of course still had their same credits, but it actually, I think, interestingly fits with how the films actually changed in tone dramatically as they alternated. If you ever wondered why You Only Live Twice was a certain way and On Her Majesty's Secret Service was completely different, like somebody did a 180 from going to the big, gargantuan, sprawling, travelogue, larger-than-life You Only Live Twice to the directly Fleming-inspired, two-fisted, human, grounded, realistic story of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then immediately going to a big, lavish Diamonds Are Forever that doesn't have any of the grounded realism human content, and then immediately going to Live and Let Die, which has real action and adventure without the sort of lavish style. It's because the producers were alternating and they had different styles. And ironically, it's Cubby Broccoli who produced the more lavish films, and Harry Saltzman, the so-called wild ideas man, who produced the more gritty, down-to-earth films. And with On Her Majesty's Secret Service now being regarded as one of, if not the best of the James Bond films, and being completely reaccepted by the general public, when it didn't get that for decades, it was considered the black sheep of the series. It's really deeply ironic that was a Harry Saltzman lead produced film. That has the hallmarks of what he did on the Harry Palmer films, of those being more serious, which harkens back to his days of being at Woodfall Productions and producing at least 2 of the most important of the British kitchen sink realism dramas. His tendency was actually to have a James Bond story be like a serious spy story and be quite a bit closer to how Fleming actually wrote it, which led to On Her Majesty's Secret Service being the most literal and direct adaptation of one of Fleming's novels of the original run of films in the 1960s. So one wishes that Saltzman was at least referenced more often if the internet adores the film that he actually lead produced, So it wasn't just that Harry Saltzman was the wild ideas man who ordered thousands of elephant shoes for the elephant stampede that was planned and never shot for the man with the golden gun. He did do this, and I love him for it because it's one of the all-time, if not the best Harry Saltzman story of all time in terms of all the wonderful anecdotes. And one can only hope that there's a closet and an Eon vault somewhere that still is stuffed full of Harry Saltzman's elephant shoes. But he was such a key contributor to what made the James Bond films magical. Without Harry Saltzman, the series would not exist. It's just plain and simple. And I can't believe that his name and just contribution is so casually discarded or glossed over. Again, if Harry Saltzman hadn't had the option, yes, Cubby Broccoli might have been able to get a deal, but he also might not have been able to get a deal. And that option was expiring. Saltzman was desperately trying to find someone to finance the films, and no one would. Even when Cubby Broccoli came along, nobody wanted to. And it was only due to his connections, chiefly at United Artists, that they even got meetings, let alone offers. And then finally UA was the one who stepped up and gave them the offer that most importantly had degrees of creative control, because had they made a deal at Columbia, which they could have, and Cubby did have relations at Columbia, they wouldn't have had that same creative control, and the Bond films would not have been able to be as risque for the times, which was part of the appeal and what made them so successful, because they made everything else look old-fashioned. That was another key aspect that I think Harry Saltzman was really striving to do, to make the films feel like they had an edge to them. And after The Man with the Golden Gun, that edge was never quite there in the same way. That energy, that wild spark, that indefinable quality of the James Bond formula, it's never been there. You can't replicate that. And that's part of the key original mixture that made the series iconic and magical. That's part of the core of the character and the cinematic James Bond, is that wild Harry Saltzman energy, that ability to completely have an idea that nobody else would have ever dreamed of, that no one's ever done before, but also have it within the constraints of something that's still gritty and realistic enough. Even if you had to have 10 other people in the room and the screenwriters and everybody telling him that his bad ideas were bad and that they needed to just focus on these, but we'll keep these really great ones because they're brilliant, like killing James Bond off at the start of the film and starting your film that way. That was a Harry Saltzman idea, even if they did it twice, technically, in From Russia with Love and, of course, You Only Live Twice. But one can't argue that is not a unbelievably arresting, bold open of a movie to kill off your lead character. Seemingly so, of course. Neither Harry Saltzman or Cubby Broccoli would be mad enough to actually do that. I'll never get over it. So anyway, this is just more of an open-ended discussion piece. It's a particular topic that has been stewing in my mind for a number of years, and as time passes, it just seems to grow more and more. And Harry Saltzman's contributions seem to be just glossed over to the point of where it seems like now they're being covered up, and even great portions of the James Bond fan base are not aware of just how dramatic his contributions were to the series. It is absolutely true that without Harry Saltzman, there would not be a James Bond film series. So with it being October 27th and the actual day of his birth, I thought it was an appropriate time to finally sort of voice some of these ideas that I've been stewing over for a number of years. And I just would hope that Harry Saltzman was talked about more, and for his contributions, in addition to the wonderful anecdotes that everybody likes to chuckle over, because he was indispensable And if you want to know more about Harry Saltzman or get greater detail into his overall background, his other film work, and of course the Eon partnership with Cubby Broccoli and the James Bond films, you have to look at Robert Seller's incredible, indispensable book, When Harry Met Cubby, which basically is a miniature biography of both men and then does the most detailed account of the producing of the first 9 films, and crucially goes into full blow-by-blow detail about the legal battle that ended the partnership and ended Harry's association with the James Bond series, which led to the Studio United Artists becoming the partner with Cubby Broccoli, which then got swallowed up into MGM, which has now been subsumed into Amazon. So the legal breakup is still with us today in that sense. And also Sellers does go into how both men's careers ultimately played out, and it's a great way to see what happened to Harry Saltzman after the fact, and unfortunately is quite sad. It is quite sad that his career never regained any sort of momentum, and he did suffer the loss of his wife as well. And it's quite sad to see that it turned out that way for Saltzman. But at the very least, there is some indication that he and Cubby Broccoli did sort of bury the hatchet. And again, Broccoli did thank Saltzman in his Thalberg acceptance speech. But one just would hope that Saltzman's contributions could actually be, at the very least, talked about more, if not honored properly, because I don't think that they are, and they truly need to be, because one can never admire and praise and study Cubby Broccoli's commitment to the James Bond franchise enough, but he wouldn't have been able to do that without Harry Saltzman. So even if they fought like cats and dogs and they were completely oil and water and they got to the point where they couldn't even be in the same room and they literally alternated films they produced, without Harry Saltzman, there wouldn't be a James Bond series. There wouldn't have been anything for Cubby Broccoli to continue. And while Cubby Broccoli was a stabilizing force throughout the 1960s and into the 70s and kept the series going, he never had the wild spark that Harry Saltzman had. And the fact that they were such polar opposites, that gives a particular energy to the eventual film product. It seeps into everything. And it's a sort of yin and yang, just like I talk about. There's a sort of yin and yang between the Terrence Young and Guy Hamilton styles of directing a Bond film, or the yin and yang between the more serious Fleming approach and the more lighthearted, fantastical, larger-than-life Goldfinger film approach. There are eternal sort of yin and yang struggles of what makes up the James Bond experience, and one of those is the difference between Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, and what those two heads butting against each other at times, what sort of sparks that gave off. Again, after Harry Saltzman left, the films were never the same, and they never will be the same. That's natural. That happens over time as people leave. It's the same thing with the films never recovering from the loss of Richard Maybaum, of losing the primary screenwriter and never again having a proper sense of narrative construction, which has been the greatest problem of the film series since License to Kill. But it pains me to no end that so many of the key team members don't get singled out the way they should. They don't get talked about the way they should. And for Harry Saltzman to sort of become forgotten to time and ignored and glossed over like he didn't matter, he was the one who got the original deal to option the novels. Without Harry Saltzman, there would be no cinematic James Bond. So anyway, I thought it would just be a nice and very fitting time to discuss some thoughts that I've had mulling around for years. I know I'm not the only fan to think this, but I think it does need to be discussed because of anyone, Harry Saltzman does not need to be forgotten in the realm of the cinematic James Bond, because he is one of the 3 most important names in the cinematic James Bond, alongside Cubby Broccoli and, of course, Ian Fleming himself. And without Harry Saltzman, there would be no James Bond film series. So, again, I would encourage people to look more closely at Saltzman's career, to especially read the indispensable Robert Sellers book, When Harry Met Cubby. I'll have links to that in the description below. I've also done a video review of that book, which is, again, indispensable. But also take the time to look at Saltzman's other films, most notably the IPCRESS File, which is a masterpiece. And again, I think it's the greatest serious non-James Bond spy film ever made, and shows some of Saltzman's sensibilities that he brought to the Bond series, and also bringing over key Bond crew members, but also his tendency to focus on more realistic dramas, harkening back to his days at Woodfall Productions. So Harry Saltzman was a lot more than just the wild ideas man that everybody likes to tell anecdotes about. He was an unbelievably crucial component of what made the James Bond film series magical and take the world by storm. His contributions were part of the magic cocktail of the James Bond film formula, and without that magic spark, the formula would not be the same, the films would not be the same, and there would be simply no films because, again, Harry Saltzman was the one who actually got the deal to option the novels, which was something Cubby Broccoli had not been able to do. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond and also my thoughts on hopefully getting people to better appreciate the contributions of producer Harry Saltzman have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, I encourage all Bond fans to look more closely at Saltzman's contributions and his overall career, which is quite fascinating and something that I think every Bond fan will find extraordinarily rewarding, because Saltzman's contributions really are part of the absolute foundation and bedrock of the cinematic James Bond. You pull that out, it's like pulling the bottom block out of the Jenga tower and everything just collapses, which of course the Cubby era in Spy would just attribute to Egyptian builders. This is just a simple discussion video that I wanted to do, but I would love to hear fellow Bond fans' thoughts in the comments below. If you yourself have thought this before, or if it hadn't even occurred to you, I would love to hear your thoughts on this particular issue and how Harry Saltzman's contributions just seem to be continually more and more, for lack of a better term, erased, because they're just not talked about, not put out there, and anything official, if it's not focused on the modern era of the films, will only talk in generalities and focus on Cubby Broccoli because he was with the series the whole time, and it's his family that's continuing the series. I personally, I mean, what I would do if I was actually making a Bond film, there's a special thing I would love to do, and something that I think Eon should actually do, is at least for one instance revive the original practice where a member of the Saltzman family is actually included in one of the films as a cameo. It was Harry's wife who was in doing cameos at the start, and then that was a practice that basically kind of got dropped and was revived with Michael G. Wilson making cameos in the films, which he continues to do. If I was making a Bond film, I would do anything to get one of the Saltzman family in, just a little background cameo, just as a little nod. It's an idea I came up with years ago, and one that I truly love. It's something that most people would probably never notice, and everybody at Eon would probably look at me like I was crazy, but it's something that I would be determined to do, and I think it would be a nice gesture. So that's something that I think could be done, and very easily, and not really be any major expenditure. So I know that's a pipe dream right there, a real fan pipe dream, but that's certainly something that I would do, and I think Eon could do to at least properly acknowledge Saltzman's contributions. But in any case, as always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond and James Bond scholarship have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Definitely keep the James Bond flag flying, keep bonding with the novels and the films, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.